Welcome to Starting a Technology Company.
Hey, so today we're going to talk a little bit about the personal aspects of what it's like to actually start a company. And so you've had some time to think about, okay, what's the company we want to build? Now is to a fair extent the harder question, which is, okay, how do I actually do this? Like, what does it take to actually lead these companies? And one of the things I think you want to have a good sense of is really, do you want to do this as part of your life? Because there are some upsides to it and there are some downsides to it. But ultimately, what I'd like is that you're able to articulate, okay, what does it really mean to be in this role of CEO? And what does that mean for my life and for sort of the person that I'm going to have to become as part of leading a company here? So, a couple different terms that you'll hear us talk through today. A big one we're going to talk about is founder-led sales. And this is just the reality that early on in most companies, the founder is doing prospecting demos, following up, closing. It really, the founder is a single person sales team that is out there running things. That can cause a lot of burnout, which is just when you are physically and emotionally depleted. It can come from lots of stress over a long period of time, which is part of starting a company. You'll also hear this term imposter syndrome, which is you might feel like you're a fraud, like you don't have the understanding or the knowledge to be able to do your job. It's actually very common in founders, where there really isn't a whole bunch of, particularly in the first time founders experience. And so you got to just go in and sort of fake it till you make it is what you'll hear a lot. And all of that will come into how do you maintain resiliency and how do you give yourself support throughout the process. The key thing I'd really help you understand is early on, a CEO in a startup company is ultimately a chief everything officer. And the CEO's job is basically doing all of the stuff that everybody else isn't capable of doing or doesn't want to do, or it doesn't make sense for them to do. And so that means across the sort of 8 or 9 dimensions that we talked about last time in a company, you're going to end up working in all of them. You're going to do some selling and some marketing to initial customers. You're going to be looking at corporate structure items and pitching investors and following up with them and trying to close them. You're trying to convince people to come work on your team when they could go get better paying jobs somewhere else. You're going to be making the decisions on products, on the priorities for the company, on what markets you target, thousands of little decisions that go with that, both operationally and strategically. And then you're also managing the process of actually building the company, which is a project management activity, and essentially being a backstop for lots of different functions. And the point is not that you're going to try to own all these functions forever. My point here is really just until the company gets to a certain size and you can potentially hire people and hand off these responsibilities, you can't really hand these things off. They all end up being things that you have to get done as you build a company. And the CEO is the person that ends up, in most cases, having to do it. So as an example, if you've just closed your first paying customer, a lot of times you'd have, let's say, 2 engineers and no salespeople. And as the CEO, what do you think you would actually be doing in that, right? Would you go hire a VP of sales so you can focus on product strategy? Would you do the next 10 sales calls? Would you delegate sales to the engineers? Probably not. Or would you focus on fundraising? And ultimately, my point here would be the CEO isn't necessarily doing any of these exact things. It's really figuring out what of these things do I just not have someone to hand to. So you would probably hand off engineering to the engineers, but we certainly wouldn't delegate sales to them. But you might have to spend time on a mix of making the next couple of sales calls, doing fundraising, and you probably don't have the option of hiring a VP of sales at this point. And so the chief everything officer concept is really that it's whatever's not getting done. That's the stuff that you have to do until you have a time to just hand that off to somebody that's more specialized in it. With that said, in most early stage companies, probably 60 to 70% of your time is principally going to get spent on founder led sales. And almost always, the first sales rep of a company needs to be the CEO. And it's not a function of you being the absolute best person to sell it. It's more that a lot of early stage companies, the CEO is the one that buyers want to work with. So it really is a strategic necessity. And there's a couple of logical reasons for that. The first is it's really difficult to hire a salesperson to come in and help sell your product because a salesperson is immediately going to ask you, what's the sales motion we have? What content do we have to help pitch this? What collateral do I have? What pipeline is there that I can actually work of leads? And a lot of the times you don't have answers for any of those things. You don't really have good and core collateral that's built out for your product. You're not really sure exactly who the buyer is and who you're going after. You don't actually have systems in place to help people do prospecting to find folks. You certainly probably don't have a sales pipeline in place. And a lot of the times, the way that you're pitching it is very, very fluid because every time you pitch it, you think of a different angle to talk through, you frame the product in a different way. And so, a lot of the times, the first thing you have to do as a salesperson, as the founder led salesperson in this case, is figure out, well, just like, how the heck do I tell this story? And how do I figure that out? And a hired salesperson can't really do that for you. The other thing you should be aware of is that early stage customers are taking a big risk with you. So, particularly in enterprise B2B sales, an early customer for a enterprise class solution wants to know that you, the founder, are there and available if something goes wrong. So they are not going to be calling your two engineers from the prior example. If something goes wrong at 2 a.m., they will call you, they will wake you up, and they will expect it to be your job to go fix things. And that's actually pretty standard in early stage companies. Customers are willing to take a risk, knowing that there is a smart, responsible person on the other end of that risk that will do whatever is required to resolve any situations that come up. Another reason we really like founder led sales and we find it to be critical is it helps you learn a lot about the actual thing that you should be building versus your initial thesis of it. Every single time you have a discussion with a prospective customer, you're going to hear different objectives. You're going to hear different priorities that they have. You're going to understand what mechanically they need to do to purchase software, to deploy that software. And it'll help you get better and better very quickly on defining what we should be building. And once you get all of that stuff going, eventually you will start to get to a point where you have a repeatable motion in place. The sales process is defined, there are stages, you know what moves people through the different stages, you know how you can qualify different customers upstream from that. You potentially even have some standardized ways of generating leads. Those are the points at which you can start to hire a salesperson. And a lot of times you can actually even specialize that salesperson where you could hire, as an example, a sales development representative whose job is to work early pipeline and schedule conversations for you. You then take the conversations and see if you can't convert them into sales. So one dimension of all that is sort of founder-led sales, and as the chief everything officer, running the sales and marketing side of it, it's probably going to be about 60% of it. Another way to think of that, though, and it dovetails very nicely with the chief everything officer, but particularly founder-led sales, is you can also think of yourself as the chief storyteller. And my point here is not that this is us all sitting around and reading books to kids at night. The key thing is that it's not just that you've built a product, it's that you're trying to make other people believe in the product and company that you have built. And the best way to do that is to give them a very clear story around why your solution or your company is a great one that they can't live without. And so while that starts with the problem, it really means not just that I understand the problem, but I understand that in a really nuanced way. I get why people care about this problem, why it causes pain in their life, why it costs them time or money or impacts their quality of life negatively. I understand the person that is feeling that, how this problem shows up in their life, why it frustrates them, why it's difficult for their career, why it's difficult for their home life. I understand why this particular solution makes sense in the context of alternatives, why other solutions that are out there don't make sense. And ultimately, all those four different things go together to help me explain a unique place that we have in the market, which is why we win. Some sort of insight advantage or approach that gives us the right to win in this market, gives us a competitively differentiated solution. And ultimately, what you're trying to do is tie all of that up into a compelling story that customers can readily understand or prospects can readily understand. And when we get that, it'll help with recruiting, it'll help with fundraising, it'll help with sales, it'll drive organizational momentum because you're consistently telling the same story of the company and why the company is critical and important in the life of your customers. Okay, we'll do a quick knowledge check here. Let's say you have a founder who says, I hate selling. I'm going to hire a great salesperson and let them handle early customers while I focus on building the product. What do you think is the core problem there? Option A, salespeople are too expensive for early stage companies. Option B, the founder will miss critical market feedback that only comes from direct customer conversations. Option C, customers will be offered that the founder, or offended, excuse me, that the founder isn't personally selling to them. Or option D, product development will suffer if the founder is too focused on it. So in this one, what I would tell you is really the key thing we're focused on here is option B, that if you're not out there in the market, you're going to miss early feedback and you're going to end up building the wrong product. And ultimately, a strong founder narrative, once you've identified the problem, once you understand sort of the research on it, is really understanding why it's this company, why it's this product, why it's this team, why we're going to win, and being able to sell that story effectively into the market. And the best way to refine that story is get out there and tell customers it and get some feedback on it. We talked a little bit about culture historically, and I've talked to a couple different people that are in the class on this. But one of the things a lot of people ask about is company culture, and you will hear a lot of CEOs, particularly of larger corporations, say, culture eats strategy for breakfast, and there's nothing more important than culture in a company. And to some extent, those things are true. The observation I would give you is in most small companies, the culture is really a reflection of the founder. And so, spending a lot of time thinking about what kind of culture do we want to develop? What kind of culture do we want to build? In my experience, that's something that doesn't really happen until the company gets to be a bigger size. And for early companies, basically all your employees will take their cue on what is acceptable behavior and what isn't acceptable behavior from you. It's going to be based on how you communicate, how you handle conflict, how you manage the company on a day to day basis. So, culture, it's not really in early stage companies like a values document. You can build those things, but it's going to be much, much more driven by like what is the founder's personality and what do they actually do? What are their actions on a day to day basis? And that includes what's your reward? So, what are you going to praise? What are you going to pay for? What are you going to tolerate? What are you going to try to drive into repetition on a day in and day out basis? And ultimately, how do you behave? How do you model it? So, I wouldn't worry too much about culture. I would worry a lot about how you act in a small company. Another thing in a small company is you're not going to have a ton of structure, process, and bureaucracy on day one. But not having a lot of process doesn't mean we don't have any process. And so, in general, what you're trying to do in terms of how we do work is really answer a couple of very basic questions. So, the first is who owns what? So, who is responsible for what specific task? And we want to make sure there is no ambiguity in who is responsible for what. We want to be clear about how we prioritize work. So, in a small company, it is very common that everything is urgent. And so, there isn't necessarily a good decision making process on what makes one thing more urgent than another thing. Another way of saying that is if everything is urgent, nothing is urgent, right? Which is to say, there are no priorities. So, you want to be crystal clear on how do we set priorities? What are the things we're working on? Typically, it's we want to get an MVP out the door and we want to get our first customers. Well, that sounds easy to say, but the implication of that is there's a lot of stuff that you might do that refines features, that extends features that we're simply not going to work on now. They're actually just not important unless they're on the actual roadmap to an MVP. You want to be really clear on how you track follow through. So if you have made a decision to do something, you want to make sure that decision is written down, that it is stored in whatever knowledge management system that you have in place, and that it informs whatever future commitments you have. I would also strongly encourage you to think about how you communicate throughout the company. In most small companies these days, you actually have too many communication mediums. And so that can result in the wrong type of information flowing through the wrong medium. As an example, if you have an email medium and you have a Slack medium, you have two different mediums you can use for text based communication. Some people will like email, some people will like Slack. What those mediums are not good for is resolving conflict. So if I have someone disagree and they start to disagree over email, that is a good example of bad medium or a bad communication area where it's going to create a lot of noise and it might create a lot of resentment, but it's not going to get a lot of resolution. And so typically what we recommend is really designing the communication mediums that you have. Be very clear with people about what kind of things are going to get covered in email, what kind of things are going to get covered in Slack, what kind of things are going to get covered live, and then the cadence of the live meetings as well. So typically that means a daily stand up, a weekly team meeting, and maybe a monthly strategy or operations meeting as well. So it doesn't have to be complicated, just has to be clear. And then the final thing is who's making decisions and how are they made? And it's basically being clear on what kind of decisions are you empowering people to make? What kind of decisions do you want as the CEO to come across your desk? So, as an example, decisions of what product we're going to build, what markets we're going to go after, who we're going to actually build a product for, those are CEO level decisions. A decision on how do we actually implement a given feature, that is not a CEO level decision, and you want to leave that to engineers so that they have agency over those decisions as well. So we talk a lot about like just the mechanics of okay, what goes into a small company. I would tell you that you also just want to pause and actually take a thought about like why do you actually want to do this? Before you go out and pitch an investor, you want to be pretty clear on what your motivation is for starting the company. They will ask you, and you could certainly tell them whatever you want. But in my experience, it's actually not any one of these individual things. It tends to be a combination of a couple of them. And ultimately, the ideal is you probably have two, if not all three of these things. So the first I would tell you is wealth is a very common motivator for starting a company. And I would also tell you it's a completely valid motivator, right? It is one of the biggest benefits of starting a technology company is that it can create wealth for you and for your family as well if you have a family. With that said, wealth tends not to be a great sustaining motivation over a long period of time. And for technology companies, you should expect they'll take about 7 to 10 years to really get off the ground. And so ultimately, if you get to year four and you haven't made a lick of money, you could have made a lot more money doing something other than a startup in most cases. And you might get through the entire startup process and have absolutely no money come out of it. So the other two categories that I would really encourage you to think about are first, do you just like the challenge of this on its own? And so a lot of the time people are wired, if you will, as an entrepreneur, with I just like building companies. I find that to be fulfilling. I find working with other people on new things to be fulfilling, and that can be helpful. And then the second is an interest in the underlying problem itself. So we call the first one fulfillment, the second alignment, but really the concepts are the important thing there. Fulfillment is I like the process of building companies and I find it genuinely interesting. And then alignment is the specific problem that I have picked here, I find to be a very interesting problem and I want to work on it. And the ideal situation here is really that you've got a couple of these things working simultaneously for you. So, sure, you might be motivated by wealth. That's pretty easy. But you also have picked a problem that you genuinely like. And my general observation to you would be there's a lot of different ways that you can make money. Finding the intersection of a good way to make money and something that I find interesting from a structural perspective to build and something that I find interesting from a domain problem perspective, that is worth searching for because it'll be a much easier thing for you to do for the course of 7 to 10 years. Okay, we talked about basic processes. Do you actually want to do this? Um, couple things that I also just set your expectations on in terms of the reality of starting a company. There are thousands and thousands, if not hundreds of thousands, of postmortems that they've done on starting a company. And so, a few things that you should know as you get at it. The first is that the odds of success are very, very low. The overwhelming likelihood is that your startup will fail, and it probably has on the order of an 8 and 10 or a 9 and 10 chance of failing. So it's about an 80 or 90% chance that it'll fail. That said, it's okay if you start a company and it doesn't work and you start another one. There tends not to be a penalty for it, but just setting your expectations, the odds of success are pretty low. Progress takes longer than you will expect. It is not a clean process. And no matter how experienced you are, you will always be overly optimistic because you are an entrepreneur, and entrepreneurs tend to be overly optimistic folks. So it takes a while. It's always going to take longer than you think. And in particular, technology companies are complicated, technically complicated to build. You will have a lot of people tell you no. You'll have a lot of investors tell you no. You'll have a lot of customers tell you no. You'll have a lot of people that you're trying to come have work for the company tell you no. That is not going to be the exception. That is something that you have to get used to. So you're going to get a lot of rejection. If you are someone that thrives on external validation, this would not be a good job for you. A lot of the work is also just boring and difficult. There is a lot of administrative work that goes into managing the process of starting a company, and the actual building of the company tends to be a smaller amount of that work, especially if you are a first time entrepreneur. It is difficult to understand what work you can ignore, and what work you have to do, and what work you should be outsourcing. And in general, you will probably think that this will happen much faster than it is. So while you have heard stories of companies coming out of nowhere and becoming very large very quickly, all of the current AI companies are good examples of that. All of those AI companies are on the order of 7 to 10 years old at this point. So they're actually older than you think they are. And most companies that succeed are succeeding around the 7 to 10 year mark. And succeeding there is not like they're going public. It's like they've broken $10 million in revenue. So it can take a very long time to get to a level of scale. And so if I tell you all those things and your response to that is, that's great, none of that applies to me, that is probably a good sign that you have what it takes to be an entrepreneur. Most entrepreneurs will hear these things, they will nod at them, they understand that they are factual, and they will also say, actually, none of those things are going to apply to me. Or I know that those things could apply to me and it doesn't matter because this is what I want to do. And so it tends to be that kind of attitude that, in my experience, does well. I don't necessarily think that's a healthy attitude, but it is an attitude that does help you do pretty well as an entrepreneur. So that's all the negative stuff. And I say that mostly by the way of disclaimer, so you know what you're getting into. With that said, what is the stuff that really actually is the positive things, the things that'll help you succeed? And in my experience, it comes down to really just like four things for technology companies. So the first is you want to have a ton of expertise in a field that you're going into. Now, you don't necessarily have to have this on day one, but you will have to build it very, very quickly because your customers will expect you to be a domain expert in whatever you are selling them. So if you're selling marketing software, your customers will expect you to know what is required in that area of marketing. Absolutely locked. So if you're selling, account-based management software, you know everything there is about account-based management. So that's what domain expertise means. I started a company in digital accessibility. I knew nothing about accessibility. By the end of that company, I was one of the, top five experts on digital accessibility on the planet. And that is the biggest thing by far that grew the growth of that company is I just knew a lot about the space. And it made me highly credible with customers, and it made it such that I could produce solutions that really solve the problems well. Domain expertise is different than technical expertise, but obviously these two things are to some extent related in the technology space. By technical expertise, I really mean you understand how software products are built in the particular technical domain that you've chosen. So as an example, here at 1 to 100, we have a combination of a particular database type, a particular hosting type, a particular front end type, of technology, a particular way of running business functions. And so you need to have a basic understanding, if not a fairly nuanced understanding of all of those different things. You can hire technical people to do this, and you can partner with technical people if you are non-technical in nature. But even if you're non-technical in nature, you will need to know enough to have intelligent conversations here. So that doesn't mean you have to be a detailed in the weeds computer programmer, but you do need to understand what are the business implications of this. And I can tell you in the technology field, people that have technical expertise in addition to domain expertise have a massive advantage. So it is a big advantage to have technical expertise in a technical field. With that said, technical expertise and go-to-market expertise are often mutually exclusive. Not always, but often this is the case. And so a lot of the times, one founder will have technical expertise, one founder will focus on go-to-market expertise. And again, each will kind of understand the other one enough to be useful. Go-to-market expertise just means you understand how you can reach customers and you can ultimately, or how you can reach prospects and ultimately turn them into customers. So go-to-market is that process of how do we educate the market about our solution? How do we identify people that should be customers? How do we take them through a sales process and turn them into actual paying customers? And that is also a pretty deep expertise domain. And so again, you can hire people to do that, but you're going to have to understand what their work is, how effective they are in that, et cetera. And so the two sort of complementing things that can be challenges here. In one case, you could be a really technical founder. So you have a lot of technical expertise, but you don't have much go to market expertise, and you will overly rely on a go to market expert when maybe more than you should. And then the flip side of it is the other pattern that you see a lot. You have a ton of go to market expertise. You don't actually have technical expertise. And so you end up building a product that actually doesn't really scratch the itch of the market or doesn't scale well. And I have certainly made both mistakes in my time. The final category I would tell you is just persistence. There's you can think of this as like grinder mentality is the other way that I talk about it. Just as I've said before, starting a company sucks. It is a really, really difficult process, and it takes a very long amount of time. And the people who tend to do well at it are just the people that are comfortable constantly grinding away at a thing over a long period of time. So if you are a person that loses interest in things quickly, if you're a person that doesn't sustain attention on something, that isn't a good thing or a bad thing, but it is indicative that you're probably not going to have a ton of success as an entrepreneur. There is a sort of the classic trope of an entrepreneur is this person that's like quickly distracted by new ideas and they're going all over the place. In my experience, that is the furthest from the truth of actual entrepreneurs who are people that are capable of maintaining a ton of attention on something for a very long period of time, probably an unhealthy level of attention on something for a very long period of time. And that is what it takes to actually be successful. And I'll give you probably my favorite business quote, which is nothing in this world can take the place of persistence. Talent will not. Nothing is more common than unsuccessful men with talent. Genius will not. Unrewarded genius is almost a proverb. Education will not. The world is full of educated derelicts. Persistence and determination alone are omnipotent. And I can tell you probably, a solid two-thirds of my success has come from just grinding away at thing over a long period of time. The challenge with that is that as you grind away from things, it is very emotionally difficult. And they study entrepreneurs extensively. And so you see elevated rates of anxiety, depression, burnout. It's not because of some flaw in people's personality. It is just the nature of the job. And I certainly suffer from anxiety. I have suffered from burnout in the past, certainly had moments of loneliness and self-doubt. All of those are part of the deal. And it is because most entrepreneurs tend to put a lot of the success of the company on their own shoulders. And so if you're suffering from these things or if these things are coming up for you, it's pretty common. I would tell you it's very normal. And while it makes a great myth that you have this sort of lone genius founder, you have, a single person that magically springs a company into reality, the vast majority of people that even have the lone genius founders had partners that they started with or have very, very strong teams around them. And they are also very quick to say how strong the teams are that are around them. So it doesn't make them less singular. Actually, one of their singular skills is finding a lot of really strong people to surround themselves with. The reason you have the myth of the lone genius is it makes a cool story. And it's a good sort of, it is a good story, and it is something that you see a lot in the press. It's not actually how it works in reality. And most of the time, people will really surround themselves. And I would also tell you just have some really good strategies for staying resilient. Your company is not you. Your company exists separate from you. So you got to set boundaries on it. You have to have blocks of time where you can leave the company, where you could take a walk through the day, where you can go and work out, whatever it is. You got to set some limits on that. I also find that between sleep, exercise, and eating healthy, you will probably be able to manage about 80 to 90% of the stress that comes with it. Particular exercise for me and good sleep for me. If I get a good exercise regimen and I sleep well, I can maintain a very, very high level of work for a very long period of time. And I can run a marathon pace versus if I don't have good sleep and I don't have good exercise, or if I don't eat well, or if I drink too much, go out too much, whatever it is, those basic physical routines will catch up pretty quick. A lot of people like having co-founders in the loop. As I mentioned last time, for first-time founders, it's very difficult to found a company on your own. It's still very difficult if you're a second-time founders. And so having somebody that you do this with is helpful. In addition, having some mentors, some people that can come in and look at what you're doing, that can be helpful too. Also understand that sometimes you gotta like take a break from the whole thing and look at it a little differently. This is an experience in my life. I spent 25 years at Level Access building a single company. I did not know when to step back. I finally forced myself to do that after 25 years, and it was the best decision I have made in the second half of my career by far. Is getting out of there. It gave me tons of perspective that I wouldn't have had in it, and so getting out of those things are quite useful. And as I said before, just understand like a lot of the feelings you experience, those are pretty normal. If you feel burnt out, if you feel anxious about it, if you're not sure if this thing is going to succeed, if you feel like you're an imposter, yeah, those are all pretty useful feelings that you have. And if you need help, let us know. We're here to help. And obviously, there's a bunch of support options for you in there. So as I mentioned before, right, if you feel like a fraud, you feel like you're surrounded by people who are smarter than you, are more competent, they'll figure out that they know what you're doing. Yeah, that's pretty common. I felt like that a lot for a long period of my career, and I've done this for 25 years, and I still feel like a lot of people around me that are doing this job are way smarter and way more capable than me. But I also understand that they probably feel that way too, and that it's okay, and you can get through that over time. So that's it for this week. Again, this one's a little bit more of a personal one. If you do want to spend some time this week, what I would recommend you think about is nothing super formal. Just think about these four questions and take a beat to answer them honestly. There's really no right answer. It's just how you feel about it. And one is, what's your motivation? Why do I want to start the company? Another way to think about that I always like is the problem interesting enough for me to spend years of my life on it? You could think about that. Is it worthwhile to spend years of my life on? Like, is it a big enough problem to spend years of my life on? But also, just is it interesting enough for me to want to spend years of my life on? As an example, the problem I'm working on now, which is building B2B SaaS companies in a standardized fashion, I find fascinating. And I could spend 10 years on it and not get paid and probably be pretty happy. It also happens to pay pretty well. So that's nice. But so thinking about that, do you like the problem enough to spend years of your life on? Is it a high enough quality problem to spend years of your life on? What makes me suited for that problem? This is a little bit of founder market fit, but it's another way of saying, am I the best person to really go after this? And then just have a thought about what in this whole process do you think is different than your expectations? So I've got expectations that, we will sell to the first 10 customers in the first 10 months, right? Is that probably a little bit overly ambitious? Maybe. So there's no specific exact thing you should be estimating properly or underestimating. It's just what are the things you think are going to happen? What are the expectations you have set for yourself that you might want to think about a little bit more in depth? And with that, we'll open it up to questions.
All right. Please feel free to unmute or drop it in the chat. All right, I'll go first. What leadership skills are the most important? Maybe say top two or top three for you. Most important during the early stages of a startup.
Yeah, so in an early stage, it's all just about clarity and specificity of who is doing what. And so a lot of times you'll read, if you read like a standard business leadership book, almost all of those are written for later stage companies. And by later stage companies, I mean much larger companies that are making decisions across a larger group of people and much longer time frames. So that doesn't mean they're not useful sometimes in startups, but startups are super tactical companies. It is like, I want to know exactly what each person is doing every day and how that gets me closer to a very specific thing, almost always like an MVP or a first customer sale. And if the person can't articulate back to you how what they are doing gets you closer to that very, very specific milestone, that means they're probably not being led effectively. So, leadership, in my mind, is less important in early stage companies than just really basic management. And a lot of times, basic management actually doesn't quite get the attention it needs in early stage companies. Like, I probably don't apply as much management as I should to my early stage company. Um, uh, just it's like the general error you make tends to be in that. So I focus less on leadership. I focus more on management. Management is really tactical, understanding who is doing what. Are they doing the thing that they need to be doing to get us closer to the goal that we have?
All right. Tim, how
Awesome.
did
Thank you.
this how did the struggles differ from your first startup to to today's startup? And
So
how
yeah,
did you learn those lessons
yeah, and
besides just doing it?
the the first time around, the biggest issue is all of your ego, identity, and self worth is bound up in the company because you don't know if you can do it. And then the second time around, in my case, I was very comfortable with the fact that I knew how to do it. And it was just much more like the how fast can we do it and how high quality can we do it at. So really, the existential questions that you want to try to get past pretty early on are like, you know, if my identity is that of an entrepreneur and my company fails, that means I'm a failure, right? Like, well, that's not true. That's an overstatement. Companies fail all the time. You could be a great entrepreneur, and the likelihood is still your company will fail. And so it's really decoupling those more like existential questions of who you are and how you think about your own self worth from the company. And that time helps in that for sure. And some of that is just, being older is helpful as well. But really, I had enough experience that and I had enough success in the first go round that I was confident that it's not that I'm got lucky the first time, it's that I'm good at this, but now I need to really refine what I'm good at. And that does help quite a bit, not really having your identity wrapped up. I'll give you the other example is I work with a lot of first time entrepreneurs. And it is very difficult for them to separate their own personal success from that of their company. And some of that is because they've gotten their friends and family to invest in their companies. They've taken on personal debt. Like they really have commingled their person with the company. And that's not because they're doing things wrong. That's because that happens a lot in early stage companies. And so it is very difficult to pull those things apart.
Okay, thanks.
Awesome. Yes. Hi, Dede. You can go ahead and unmute. I can see you've raised your hand.
All right, all right. Confirm you can hear me.
Yep, you're good.
Yes, we can hear you. Thank you.
All right. So my question is this: when you have a startup, or when you're starting up the company, right? Obviously, you're the visioneer. Like you have the vision of where you want your company to be, or whatever you want it to look like in the future. So how do you manage the dailies? Obviously, you're just one person. I know it's a startup, but let's imagine that you're in engineering or technology, and this requires a whole lot of your attention and managing a whole lot of things. So what would you advise that someone does in that kind of situation? Do you have maybe some sort of an integrator keeping you running your dailies while you just focus on the vision and like the strategic direction of the company, or how do you go about it generally?
So I am of the opinion that in early stage companies, but even in pretty late stage companies, you really want to hire doers rather than managers. And if you hire managers, you want to have the absolute highest leverage on them possible. So in the example of, hey, it's an early stage company, I've got one person, and who do I want to hire next? I would hire the person that does the most actual work to get to the next milestone versus trying to hire a person that would, would potentially like project manage the team or do things like that. And I would rather take on the work of project managing the team. As an example, a mistake I see a lot would be like it's an early stage founder, they've had some success, they've got some customers, and they're like, hey, I really want to focus on sales. I don't want to focus on management. And so they hire someone to manage the team for them in the operations. Well, if you hire that person, they then need your time and attention. They're going to need process manuals that are sitting in your head. It's not really very easy to hire that person, but it might be very easy to hire someone to set appointments for you on the sales side, or follow up with things. So part of it is the way I would really look at that is like, what is the company trying to accomplish now? And what are the best roles we can hire that are doing actual work for us, like, right, that are either coding the product or doing these different things. And basically there's two categories. It's you're either working to deliver the product and make it better, or you're working to get new customers for us, and trying to hire people that are pretty much in the weeds for that. But my general experience is you really shouldn't be hiring professional managers in a startup until you get to about, at earliest, 12 people, but really more like 20 people. And with some clever work these days, you can have a pretty big span of control as the CEO. But I have I have a very specific point of view on that. Others may tell you something different.
Okay. I think that covers it to an extent. Thank you very much for your response.
Thank you. Anyone with any other question before we wrap up today's session? Please feel free to go ahead and not any other question. I'll just give it a few seconds.
No, just a quick note. We're doing next week is pitch decks. So we'll do pitch decks. For the pitch decks, all you really want is that like kind of an overview document of, hey, here's the idea that we have, and then we can use that to generate a pitch deck. And we can send out a secondary document that also covers business plan formatting. And it'll basically just go back through the last couple of weeks, and then you can see how all the stuff we've been doing actually maps into a business plan as well. And so you can use that to produce a business plan also, which is pretty helpful.